All right, this is part 2 of Positive Punishment, Chapter 14 from Cooper. Let's look at some positive punishment interventions. First is reprimands. The delivery of verbal reprimands is perhaps the most common form of positive punishment. They are more effective when motivation for the problem behavior has been minimized. So you've got to be aware of those motivating operations, and the availability of an alternative behavior is maximized. Reprimands should be used thoughtfully and sparingly in combination with frequent praise and attention contingent on the appropriate behavior. Response blocking. This involves physically intervening as soon as a person begins to emit the problem behavior. So response blocking is associated with a physical intervention. It is effective in reducing the frequency of problem behaviors such as chronic hand mouthing, eye poking, and pica. Pica is eating inedible objects, ingesting inedible objects. Response blocking is often implemented as a treatment for SIB or other self-stimulatory behaviors and involves providing prompts and reinforcement for an alternative response in order to minimize side effects such as resistance and aggression. So, in effect, with response blocking, you're physically intervening, you are suppressing that behavior, and so it is considered a form of punishment. Then there is RIRD, response interruption and redirection. It's a procedural variation of response blocking. It includes interrupting stereotypical behavior at its onset, right when it begins, redirecting the individual to complete a high probability behavior instead, so using behavioral momentum strategies. Two types of RIRD are motor and vocal. Both have been used primarily with individuals with autism who emit high levels of repetitive, stereotypical non-functional behaviors. Contingent exercise. This happens sometimes on sports teams. This is when the client is required to perform a response that is not topographically related to the problem behavior. It has been shown effective for various self-stimming, stereotypic, disruptive, aggressive, and self-injurious behaviors. I often think about a coach on a team that requires the players that show up late for practice to run laps. Contingent exercise intended to decrease that showing up late behavior. All right, overcorrection is a punishment procedure. Contingent on each occurrence of the problem behavior, the learner is required to engage in effortful behavior directly or logically related to the problem behavior. There are two types of overcorrection. One is restitutional overcorrection. The other is positive practice overcorrection. With restitutional correction, you are repairing the damage caused by the problem behavior to its original state. You are returning the environment to its original state, making restitution. You are engaging in additional behavior that brings the environment to a condition better than it was prior to the misbehavior. So not only are you returning the environment to its original state, for example, a student throws a piece of paper across the room and it hits the floor instead of the trash can. So the restitutional overcorrection would be the teacher having that student pick up that paper, throw it in the trash can, and then walk around the classroom and pick up any other little bits of paper that are on the floor. So you're not only returning the environment to its original state without your piece of paper on the floor, you're picking up all the other paper as well. The environment's in even better condition than it was prior. Positive practice overcorrection is involving repeated performance of the correct form of the behavior or a behavior incompatible with the problem behavior. So let's look at guidelines for using punishment. Punishment may be a treatment of choice when the problem behavior produces serious physical harm, when reinforcement-based treatments have not reduce the problem behavior to socially acceptable levels. When the reinforcer maintaining the problem behavior either cannot be identified or cannot be withheld. So there are several guidelines that help us as practitioners apply punishment with optimal effectiveness while also minimizing undesirable side effects and problems. So first, we should look to select effective and appropriate punishers. And we would start by conducting a punisher assessment. According to Fisher and colleagues from 1994, the sooner an ideal punisher can be identified, the sooner it can be applied. And data may allow us to deliver the lowest intensity punisher that also achieves that socially significant response suppression. Remember that we are seeking to suppress behavior, problem behavior, and that research shows that a more intense punisher can achieve that suppression more quickly. So we want to identify what's that lowest level, what's the lowest intensity of that higher intensity punisher that we can use, so we don't have to go to the most extreme, most intense punishers and we can still get that socially significant response suppression. So one thing to do is to use varied punishers that have sufficient quality and intensity. So beginning with a punishing stimulus of sufficient intensity is important, and having the variety of punishers helps us avoid habituation effects. So the learner becomes accustomed to the punisher, it has less effectiveness. The effectiveness can decrease with repeated presentations of the stimulus. So using a variety of punishers can reduce those effects and increase the effectiveness of less intrusive punishers. We should also plan to deliver the punisher at the very beginning of the behavior or the behavioral sequence and punish each instance initially, that continuous punishment schedule, just like we would use a continuous reinforcement schedule. Then gradually shift to an intermittent schedule of punishment. That continuous schedule is used to diminish the problem behavior to a clinically acceptable level. Then we begin gradually thinning to an intermittent schedule. We should also plan to combine intermittent punishment with extinction, which means we should seek to minimize that learner's access to reinforcers for that behavior so the punishment is most effective. If necessary, if you see that behavior begin to emerge again, you should return to that continuous schedule of reinforcement. After recovery of acceptable low rates of responding, then you should gradually shift back to an intermittent schedule of punishment that is denser than what you used previously. So use your data to help you decide what you need to do next. We should also look to mediate unavoidable response to punishment delay. Consequences that are intended to serve as punishers are frequently delayed in the natural environment. So as behavior analysts, we should strive to mediate that response to punishment delay as much as possible. Sometimes this will just include, at a minimum, providing an instruction or a rule to let the learner know that the punishment process is in effect and will be delivered at a later point in time. We should not ever plan to use punishment in isolation. We should always plan to supplement it with complementary interventions such as differential reinforcement, extinction, or there are a variety of antecedent interventions that we can use as well. The reinforcement of an alternative behavior can enhance the suppressive effects of punishment and enable what was a relatively benign or potentially ineffective punishment procedure to become much more effective, even for chronic problem behaviors. We should also watch and plan for negative side effects. If we're working with caregivers, with teachers, we also need to help them watch and plan for these negative side effects as well. Very often the suppression of one problem behavior by punishment leads to an increase in other undesirable behaviors, which means we need to record, graph, and evaluate data daily. The suppressive effects of punishment are usually quick and abrupt, but then we need to watch, make our plans for thinning the punishment schedule and continuing to evaluate. This leads us to ethical considerations regarding the use of punishment. So every learner, every individual has a right to safe and humane treatment. So any behavior change program must be physically safe for all involved, the learner and the caregivers and the behavior therapist, everyone that works with this learner. It should not contain any elements that would cause injury to the learner or would be degrading or disrespectful to them. Humane treatments are designed for their therapeutic effectiveness, to have effects on decreasing the problem behavior. They should be delivered in a compassionate and caring manner. We need to work to remove any animosity or inappropriate behaviors that we might exhibit because of our previous interactions with this learner. Humane treatment should be assessed formatively, progress monitoring to determine the effectiveness of the treatment. We should terminate it or move to something else if effectiveness is not demonstrated. If we have actually landed on an appropriate, effective intervention, we will see quick results. The humane treatment should be sensitive and responsive to the overall physical, psychological, and social needs of that person. So less intrusive procedures should be tried and found to be ineffective. We need to actually show by data that they're not working before we move to more intrusive punishment procedures. Restrictiveness actually will depend on the procedural details, rest at the level of the person with whom it's implied. However, research, Gaston Woolery and other researchers have said if you have to choose between a less intrusive but ineffective procedure, right? So you need to try a less intrusive procedure first. If it's not effective and you have to choose between that and a more intrusive but effective procedure, you should always go for the effective procedure, right? Because that's actually most ethical. We want to see that behavior change. And then we can incorporate other strategies, other like reinforcement strategies and extinction procedures with that punishment procedure, and then start moving systematically to thin that punishment procedure. But to be ethical, we also do need to have an effective procedure in place. Failing to use a punishment procedure, right? You know, punishment procedures are not our go-to. It's not the first thing we would use. However, failing to consider it actually withholds a potentially effective treatment for certain behaviors, and in effect risks maintaining a dangerous or uncomfortable state for that person. All right, so as we consider the right to effective treatment, we do need to consider punishment procedures in our entire toolbox of interventions. As Iwata, 1988, explained, if all other less intrusive treatments with a sufficient research base to provide a legitimate chance of success have failed, the use of punishment procedures is the only ethical option. Should not be our go-to, but it needs to be, we do need to reserve the right to use a punishment procedure. So punishment policy and procedural safeguards. If we have decided as a team to use a punishment procedure, we should adopt and use dynamic, changeable policies. We should be evaluating and changing as needed. We should have procedures that provide clear guidelines and safeguards for our practitioners and our clients. Agencies, companies, schools can protect and ensure their clients' students' rights to safe, humane, least restrictive, and effective treatment by developing policy and procedural guidelines that everyone in that company must follow when punishment-based intervention is implemented. So these are procedural policy guidelines from Cooper, figure 14.1. 8.12. Intervention must conform to all local, state, and federal statutes. This means you need to be aware of what your local, state, and federal statutes are. Intervention must conform to the policies and codes of ethical conduct of relevant professional organizations. So think about the BACB. Intervention should include procedures for strengthening and teaching alternative behaviors. So your punishment procedures should not occur in isolation. Intervention must include plans for generalization and maintenance of behavior change and criteria for eventual termination or reduction of punishment. And very, very important, informed consent must be obtained from the client or parent or legal advocate before intervention begins. Procedural safeguards. Before your intervention begins, all relevant staff must be trained in the technical details to properly administer the procedure, the procedures for ensuring the physical safety of the client and staff, and the humane treatment of the client, and what to do in the event of negative side effects. This would include emotional outburst, escape and avoidance aggression, noncompliance. Supervision and feedback of staff who administer the punishment procedure intervention must be provided. So it should not be one staff member implementing the punishment procedure. There should be other staff present to support, collect data, and then their feedback should be provided. Booster training sessions should be provided as needed. Evaluation requirements. Each occurrence of the problem behavior should be observed and recorded. Each delivery of the punisher must be recorded and the client's reactions noted. Periodic review of the data by a team that includes the parents, the staff members, outside consultants if necessary, must be conducted to ensure that ineffective treatment is not prolonged. Effective treatment should be terminated at appropriate times. Social validity data must be obtained from the client, significant others, and the staff on treatment acceptability, real and likely impact of behavioral change on the client's current circumstances and future prospects. So plans must be in place in events of severe behavior so that the teacher, the behavior analyst is not by themselves with the learner. Someone else needs to be there to assist with the management of the severe behavior, also to provide that data collection piece. So, in conclusion, punishment's natural and necessary role in survival and learning should be recognized. Positive and negative punishment contingencies do occur naturally in everyday life as a complex mix of concurrent reinforcement and punishment contingencies. Think of survival. We survive because we have learned to suppress certain behaviors that could result in very serious natural punishments. Focus on research on punishment is needed. So we have a limited amount of research on punishment. Additional basic research on the mechanisms and variables that produce punishment will uncover elements that remain tangled in complex variables and their interactions. And we should also not plan to use unconditioned punishers. They are actually should be treated as default technologies that we want to avoid. Behavior analysts should not advocate for the use of aversive technologies. Old behavior analysts prior to the BCBA would use strategies such as spraying water in a learner's face or putting a little bit of lemon juice on their tongue as an aversive treatment, but we should no longer use these. They might be used in research, but they really should not be used in practice. So above all, my closing comments are, as behavior analysts, we should focus on reinforcement strategies first and foremost. We should use our data collection. We should use our functional behavior assessments to determine when and if a punishment practice may be necessary. If so, we should conduct assessments to determine the most effective punishment treatment that has the least intensity necessary to have results. And always use it in conjunction with reinforcement strategies as well.